divers. Welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that I know you're all interested in, lab-grown meat.
Oh, yeah.
But specifically, we're going to be looking at why some U.S. states are trying to ban it before it even hits most grocery stores.
Interesting.
And we've got some excerpts here from a Slashdot article to unpack this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild.
It is pretty wild.
Its whole story, and it feels like something out of science fiction.
Right.
But this push to ban lab-grown meat, I mean, this is really happening. It's real. And it highlights a really a fascinating kind of tension, I guess, between the future of food and these, deeply rooted kind of interests of traditional agriculture.
It's true. And we're talking about states like Alabama, Arizona, and Florida, where lawmakers are introducing bills to protect what they call traditional agriculture. And they're even going so far as to declare a war on ranching.
It's clear that this rise of lab-grown meat is being perceived as a direct threat to the existing agricultural industry. Yeah. Especially, cattle ranching. And when you think about the economic impact, it's easy to see why there's such a strong pushback, right?
Totally. And this article mentions that the U.S. cattle industry alone is worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
Wow.
And those dollars, that supports entire communities and ways of life for people.
Exactly. But I think beyond the economics, there's also, like a cultural element at play here. For generations, ranching has been a cornerstone of American identity.
For sure.
Particularly in certain regions, so this idea of meat being produced in a lab, divorced from the land and the traditional practices, it's unsettling.
It's true.
For some people.
It's like they see this as an attack on their heritage.
Yeah.
And their way of life.
Yeah.
And to even understand this whole debate, we need to even just define, what is lab-grown meat?
Yeah, that's a good question. So lab-grown meat, it's also called cell-cultured meat. It's produced by taking a small sample of animal cells, usually muscle cells, and growing them in a nutrient-rich solution in a controlled lab environment. You can think of it almost like brewing beer, but instead of yeast, we're using animal cells.
Okay.
And these cells multiply and they differentiate to form muscle tissue.
Okay.
Which is, the main component of the meat that we eat.
So it's not some kind of imitation meat made from plants.
Right.
Like those veggie burgers.
Right.
That we see everywhere. This is actual animal tissue.
Exactly, precisely.
It's grown a different way.
Yeah, and that's a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
Because it gets to the heart of why these bans are causing such a stir.
Yeah.
I mean, lab-grown meat has the potential to disrupt the entire meat industry.
Absolutely.
As we know it.
Yeah, and this article highlights that 16 states already have laws in place.
Wow.
Regulating how lab-grown, plant-based, even insect-based products can even be labeled.
Labeling is a major battleground.
Yeah.
In this whole emerging industry.
Right.
Supporters of lab-grown meat argue that clear and accurate labeling is essential for consumer transparency.
Yeah.
It allows people to make informed choices about what they're buying.
Right.
But, those opposed to the technology, they often push for labeling restrictions.
Yeah.
That could make it harder for lab-grown meat to compete. With traditional meat products.
It sounds like some of these labeling laws are almost designed to confuse consumers.
Yeah.
And protect the market share of existing meat producers.
Yeah.
But let's go back to why this technology is even on the table in the first place.
Yeah, well, one of the primary drivers behind the development of lab-grown meat is the environmental impact of conventional livestock farming. The article mentions that agriculture contributes about 11% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. That might not sound like a lot, but...
But when you break it down further, livestock, particularly cattle, are responsible for a quarter of those agricultural emissions.
Yeah.
And it's not just CO2 we're talking about.
Exactly. Methane.
Yeah.
A potent greenhouse gas released primarily through cattle burps and manure is a major concern.
Really?
And methane's warming potential is about 80 times greater than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period.
Oh, wow.
So this means that even though agriculture might seem like a small slice of the emissions pie, the type of emissions matters.
Yes.
A lot.
Those methane numbers are pretty alarming.
Yeah.
I remember last year when over 150 countries pledged to cut food and agriculture emissions at the UN Climate Summit.
Yeah.
It feels like the pressure is really on to find more sustainable ways to feed a growing global population.
Absolutely. And lab-grown meat is being touted as a potential solution.
Right.
Proponents argue that it could significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to traditional meat production. One study estimated that lab-grown meat could require up to 96% less land and 80 to 96% less water, while producing 96% fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to conventional beef production.
Those figures are pretty impressive.
Yeah.
It sounds like a potential game changer for the environment.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story, right?
Yeah.
What about the actual process of producing lab-grown meat? How sustainable is that?
That's a great question, and that's where things get a little more complicated.
Okay, I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty.
All right.
Let's unpack the science behind growing meat in a lab.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, deep divers, buckle up. We're about to take a microscopic journey into the fascinating world of cell-cultured meat.
Okay, so the first step in producing this lab-grown meat is you got to select the right cell lines.
Okay.
These are essentially starter cells taken from an animal, usually through like a harmless biopsy.
Okay.
Scientists are experimenting with different types of cells, including muscle stem cells and even fat cells, to create different cuts and textures of meat.
So you could have like a lab-grown ribeye steak.
Yeah.
Or even a juicy lab-grown burger.
Exactly.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty cool.
But what happens after you have those starter cells?
Yeah.
How do you actually grow them into something resembling meat?
So that's where the growth medium comes in.
Okay.
It's essentially a nutrient-rich broth that provides the cells with, everything they need to grow and multiply. Think of it as like the special sauce that fuels the whole process.
Okay, so we've got our starter cells.
Yeah.
We've got our nutrient broth.
Yep.
But cells are tiny.
They are.
How do you go from a bunch of microscopic cells to a piece of meat you can actually sink your teeth into?
That's a great Goran, and that's where the magic of scaffolding comes in.
Oh, okay.
So scientists are using various techniques to create these three-dimensional structures that act as a framework for the cells to grow on.
Okay.
This scaffolding can be made from different materials, including edible ones like plant-based proteins or even synthetic polymers that are later removed. As the cells multiply and differentiate, they attach to this scaffolding, they form muscle fibers, and eventually it creates a structure that resembles actual meat.
So it's like building a house.
Exactly.
You need the bricks, the mortar, and the framework to create something solid and structured.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And just like in construction, the scaffolding used in lab-grown meat production plays a crucial role in determining the final texture and shape of the product.
It's amazing how scientists are essentially mimicking this natural process of muscle growth, but in a controlled lab setting.
Yeah, it is amazing.
But this all sounds pretty high-tech.
It is.
And resource-intensive.
Yeah.
So how does this compare to traditional meat production in terms of sustainability?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And the answer is, it's complicated.
Okay.
While lab-grown meat has the potential to be significantly more sustainable than conventional meat production, it's not, a silver bullet. The environmental impact of lab-grown meat depends on several factors, including the source of energy used to power the labs, the efficiency of the production process, and the type of growth medium used.
So there's still a lot of research and development needed to optimize the process and make it truly sustainable on a large scale.
Absolutely. One of the biggest challenges right now is the cost and complexity of the growth medium. I mean, it's a crucial component, but it's also expensive, and it often relies on ingredients derived from animal products, which kind of defeats the purpose of creating a more ethical and sustainable meat alternative.
That's a big hurdle.
It is.
It sounds like scientists are working on developing plant-based growth mediums that are both affordable and effective.
Exactly, and that's just one area of active research. Scientists are also exploring ways to improve the efficiency of the cell growth process, reduce energy consumption, and develop more sustainable scaffolding materials.
So it's still early days, but there's a lot of potential for lab-grown meat to become like a truly viable and sustainable alternative to traditional meat production.
I think so. But even if we overcome these technical hurdles,
there
are still social, economic, and political challenges to consider.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And those proposed bans we talked about earlier really highlight this complex web of interests at play here.
Yeah, these bans are a direct response to the perceived threat that lab-grown meat poses to traditional agriculture.
Right.
And it's not just about economics, it's about, power, control, and the future of our food system.
This article even mentioned that some lawmakers are framing these bans as a way to protect consumers from being misled or tricked into buying something they don't understand.
Yeah, that's a common tactic used to stifle innovation and competition.
Yeah.
They're trying to paint lab-grown meat as something unnatural, like frankenfood that's somehow unsafe or inferior to traditional meat.
But isn't it ironic that they're using this argument of consumer protection while simultaneously pushing for labeling laws that could actually confuse consumers?
It is quite a contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're trying to have it both ways. On one hand, they're saying lab-grown meat is so different and potentially dangerous that it needs to be banned.
Right.
But on the other hand, they're pushing for labeling regulations that make it harder for consumers to distinguish between lab-grown meat and traditional meat.
It seems like their real concern is not about consumer protection,
Right.
but about protecting the market share of traditional meat producers.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's important to recognize that there are powerful economic interests at play here.
Yeah.
Trying to maintain the status quo and resist change.
Speaking of resisting change, you mentioned earlier that there's like a cultural element to this pushback as well.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. Or for many people, meat is more than just food. It's a symbol of tradition, heritage, and even masculinity.
Mm.
And the idea of meat being produced in a lab, divorced from the land, and the hard work of ranchers and farmers, it challenges those deeply held beliefs and values.
It's like they see lab-grown meat as a threat to their identity and their way of life.
Exactly. And that's why this debate is so much more than just a scientific or economic argument.
Right.
It's a cultural clash.
Yeah.
It's a battle over what we value and how we define our relationship with food and the natural world.
It's fascinating how something as seemingly simple as a piece of meat can ignite such a complex and multifaceted debate.
It really speaks to the power of food as a cultural touchstone.
Yeah.
What we eat is deeply intertwined with our beliefs, values, and identities.
And in this case, the rise of lab-grown meat is forcing us to confront some pretty fundamental questions, right?
Yeah.
About our food system, our relationship with animals, even our own sense of self.
Absolutely. And those are questions that are only going to become more pressing as technology continues to advance and reshape the world around us.
So even if lab-grown meat does become commercially viable and overcomes the technical hurdles.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a long road ahead in terms of winning over hearts and minds.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not just about creating a product that's affordable and tasty.
Right.
It's about addressing the cultural anxieties, the ethical concerns, and the deep-seated resistance to change that this technology evokes.
And that brings us back to those Slashdot comments we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What are people saying about all of this?
Well, the comments section is a fascinating microcosm of this larger societal debate.
Right.
You have people who are excited about the potential of lab-grown meat to revolutionize the food industry, reduce animal suffering, mitigate climate change.
Those are some pretty compelling arguments in favor of the technology.
Yeah.
What about the other side?
Yeah.
What are some of the main concerns people are expressing?
Well, many commenters are expressing skepticism
Yeah.
about the taste and texture of lab-grown meat.
Okay.
They wonder if it'll ever truly replicate the experience of eating a real steak or burger.
That's a fair point. I think a lot of people are hesitant to embrace something new, especially when it comes to food.
Yeah.
We're creatures of habit and tradition.
Absolutely. And there are also concerns about the affordability of lab-grown meat.
Right.
Right now, it's still a very expensive product to produce, and it's unclear if it can ever compete with the price of traditional meat.
Right.
On a large scale.
But didn't the article mention that the cost of production has been steadily decreasing as the technology advances?
That's true, but it's still a major hurdle to overcome if lab-grown meat is going to become mainstream.
Right. And of course, we can't forget those commenters who are suspicious of anything that seems artificial or unnatural.
Yeah.
They view lab-grown meat as, frankenfood, a product of scientific hubris that shouldn't be messed with.
That's a common reaction to new technologies, especially those that challenge our existing beliefs and practices. It's the fear of the unknown, the suspicion of anything that seems to disrupt the natural order.
It's interesting how these anxieties often manifest as concerns about safety or health.
Exactly. People worry that lab-grown meat might be somehow less healthy or even dangerous compared to traditional meat.
But isn't there a lot of scientific research being done to ensure the safety and nutritional value of lab-grown meat?
Yes, absolutely. Scientists are rigorously testing lab-grown meat for any potential health risks, and the early evidence suggests that it's just as safe and nutritious as traditional meat.
So it seems like a lot of the fear surrounding lab-grown meat is based on unfounded assumptions and just a general distrust of anything that seems too sci-fi or futuristic.
I think that's part of it, but it's also important to acknowledge that people have, legitimate concerns about the potential unintended consequences of new technologies. Well, some people worry that the widespread adoption of lab-grown meat could lead to job losses in the traditional agricultural industry. They see it as a threat to the livelihoods of, farmers, ranchers, all those who depend on the existing meat production system.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Technological disruption often leads to job displacement, and it's crucial that we think about how to support those who might be affected by these transitions.
Absolutely. And there are also concerns about the potential for consolidation and monopolization in the lab-grown meat industry.
Right.
What happens if a handful of large corporations end up controlling the production and distribution of this new food source?
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
We've seen how consolidation in other industries like big ag and big pharma can lead to higher prices,
Right. Yeah.
reduced consumer choice, and lack of transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And those are the same concerns that are being raised about the potential for a big lab-grown meat industry to emerge.
It sounds like we need to be really careful about how we regulate and manage this emerging technology.
Yeah.
To ensure that it benefits society as a whole.
Yeah.
And not just a select few.
I agree. I think it's crucial that we have, thoughtful and inclusive conversations about the potential benefits and risks of lab-grown meat, involving stakeholders from all sides of the issue.
So what does this all mean for the future of lab-grown meat? Will these bans succeed in stopping its progress, or will they backfire and actually accelerate its adoption?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's certain. Lab-grown meat is here to stay.
Right.
This technology is advancing rapidly, and the demand for alternative protein sources is only going to increase as the global population grows and the environmental impact of conventional livestock farming becomes more apparent.
So it's not a question of if, but when lab-grown meat becomes, a mainstream food option.
I think that's right. And these bans might actually end up having the unintended consequence of making lab-grown meat even more appealing to some consumers.
Like that Streisand effect you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The more people try to ban or suppress something, the more attention it gets and the more curious people become.
So these attempts to stifle innovation might actually backfire and end up giving lab-grown meat a boost.
It's definitely possible. And it highlights how important it is to to engage in open and honest dialogue about new technologies rather than resorting to fear-mongering and censorship.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating, complex topic with no easy answers.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that this debate is ultimately about something much bigger than just a piece of meat.
You're right. It's about the future of our food system, the health of our planet, and our evolving relationship with the natural world.
And those are conversations we need to be having. So, deep divers, as we delve deeper into the world of lab-grown meat and the surprising bans it's facing, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. If lab-grown meat becomes indistinguishable from traditional meat in taste, texture, and price, would you choose it?
What factors would influence your decision?
Would it be environmental concerns, animal welfare, personal health, or something else entirely?
There's no right or wrong answer here.
Right.
But it's a question worth exploring.
And we'll continue that exploration in the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve into the ethical considerations surrounding lab-grown meat and explore the potential implications of this game-changing technology. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, Deep Divers.
So we've covered a lot of ground talking about lab-grown meat, everything from how they grow it in the lab to the economics, But now I think it's time to tackle the ethics. Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Lab-grown meat, it challenges us to rethink our whole relationship with animals and the definition of even what it means to eat meat.
Yeah, we've already talked about some of the ethical arguments, right, in favor of lab-grown meat, like reducing animal suffering and creating a more sustainable food system.
Right.
But what about the other side?
Yeah.
What are some of the ethical concerns that people are raising about this whole thing?
Well, one concern is that, lab-grown meat could further disconnect us, from the natural world and the origins of our food.
Okay.
So if we can grow meat in a lab, will we lose sight of the fact that it actually comes from, living animals?
That's a good point. It's like the difference between, picking a ripe tomato from your garden and buying a plastic-wrapped tomato from the supermarket. You lose that connection to the source.
Exactly. And some people worry that this disconnect could lead to a devaluation of animal life. So if meat becomes just another manufactured product, will we care less about the welfare of the animals that, it's derived from?
I mean, it's almost like we're entering this new era of food philosophy.
Yeah.
Where, we're grappling with questions we've never even had to ask before.
And there are no easy answers. I mean, some people argue that lab-grown meat is actually a more ethical choice because it eliminates the need to raise and slaughter animals for food.
Right.
They believe it's a way to satisfy our desire for meat without causing harm to living creatures.
Yeah, that's a compelling argument.
Yeah.
But what about the argument that even though lab-grown meat doesn't involve, killing animals, it still relies on those animal cells to start?
Right.
So does that blur the lines ethically?
Yeah, that's a valid question, and it gets to the heart of the debate about animal rights and whether we have a moral obligation to avoid using animals for our own purposes, even if it doesn't cause them, direct harm.
It seems like there's a whole spectrum of ethical viewpoints on this whole issue, and where you fall on that spectrum might influence how you feel about lab-grown meat.
Absolutely. And it's important to have these conversations, and to respect the diversity of perspectives on this, on this complex issue. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
So as lab-grown meat becomes, more commercially viable and enters the mainstream, we're likely to see these ethical debates intensify.
Yeah, I think so. And that's a good thing. It means that we're engaging with the implications of this technology and grappling with these profound questions, right?
Yeah.
That it raises about our relationship with food, with animals, and the natural world.
It's almost like lab-grown meat is it's a mirror reflecting back our own values and beliefs about the world.
I like that analogy. And what we see in that reflection might surprise us.
It certainly surprised me. This deep dive has taken us on a journey. We started by looking at some proposed bans on lab-grown meat, and we ended up exploring, everything from the science of cell cultures to the philosophy of food ethics.
It's a testament to the power of this whole technology to ignite our curiosity and challenge our assumptions about the world.
It's definitely made me think differently about, the future of food and the choices we make as consumers.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, right?
Totally.
Expanding our understanding, challenging our perspectives, and sparking those aha moments.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of lab-grown meat, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. This technology, it's rapidly evolving, right?
It is.
And it has the potential to reshape our world, in some really profound ways. But the future of lab-grown meat, it isn't just a matter of science and technology. It's also a matter of values, ethics, and the choices we make, as individuals and as a society.
And those choices will shape the world we create.
So keep those minds curious, keep those critical thinking skills sharp, and keep exploring the world around you. Until next time, fellow deep divers.